He's a former soldier with a dark past, and his wife's affair just turned deadly. Will John Taylor save her in time, or let her face the ultimate punishment? Watch now to see how this story ends. John Taylor sat at the bar of the Rusty Anchor, sipping his rum and coke, while patiently waiting for a message on his phone. The dim lighting and the steady hum of conversations made the bar feel both secluded and lively. As John took a long sip, he couldn't help but think about the events that had brought him to this moment in his life. Born 38 years ago in Portland, Oregon, John had lived an ordinary life until it all changed. After high school, he married his first love, Sarah, right after graduation. Sarah was everything to him back then, and together they moved forward with their lives. John got a job working on the oil pipelines in Alaska, traveling for weeks on end, fixing problems, and working grueling shifts from Prudhoe Bay to Fairbanks. But that life on the road came at a cost. One day, after a long 6-week stretch away from home, he returned to find Sarah in bed with not one, but 2 of his former classmates. Her excuses, that it didn't mean anything and was just a physical thing, rang hollow to John. The betrayal hit him hard. He divorced her and made a drastic decision to enlist in the military, hoping to leave everything behind and rebuild his life. At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where John was stationed after basic training, he met his second wife, Rebecca. She was smart, independent, and seemed to understand him better than anyone else. At first, it felt like a fresh start, and John thought he had finally found the right person. But, after returning from a grueling 12-month deployment in Afghanistan, he found Rebecca in bed with another soldier from the base. Devastated once again, he ended the marriage after less than 2 years, eerily similar to the length of his first marriage. By now, John was around 43 years old, hardened and more cautious. He threw himself into his work, determined to become the best soldier he could. His single mission became simple: kill the enemy. And he became damn good at it. After his service in the Army, John was recruited as a private contractor, working for various interests across Africa, the Middle East, and even South America. His assignments ranged from securing assets in hostile territories to assisting local factions in overthrowing oppressive regimes. John's reputation grew quickly, and soon he was one of the most sought-after mercenaries. His experience made him not just dangerous, but also strategic in his approach to each mission. But John wasn't a mindless soldier of fortune. He was picky about his clients, refusing to work for anyone involved in drugs or human trafficking. Sometimes he took lower-paying contracts simply because he believed in the cause. Another thing that made John stand out was his choice of weapon. While most of his colleagues favored the latest high-tech firearms, John stuck with an old World War II-era Thompson submachine gun, a relic he bought from a dealer in Houston, Texas, who claimed it had been used in the Korean War. The dealer's stories were colorful. He even suggested that the gun might have been owned by a famous mobster in the 50s, but John didn't care about the history. What mattered was that the weapon felt right in his hands. The Thompson was well maintained, came with 2 large magazines, and included a drum that could hold 100 rounds of .45 caliber ammunition. Its effective range was only about 150 meters, but at close quarters, the Thompson was deadly. And for John, that was all that mattered. The gun's raw power suited his straightforward style. The years of contracting work took their toll, though. By the time he reached his mid-40s, John had grown weary of the constant violence and the endless cycle of contracts. He decided it was time to return home, try to build something stable, and leave his bloody past behind. He accepted a position as a security consultant for a private firm and moved to Denver, Colorado. There, he hoped to start fresh. That's where he met Laura, his third wife. They met at a charity gala where John had been hired to handle security for the event. Laura was a well-respected attorney working for the high-profile law firm Preston & Caldwell. They literally bumped into each other at the event as Laura made her way to the bar. John caught her just before she tripped over someone's purse, and their eyes met. John thought nothing of it at first, but Laura was immediately taken by his quiet demeanor and the scar that ran down the side of his face, a relic from his past missions. They spent the rest of the evening talking, and soon after, they began dating. John, having been burned twice before, was careful not to reveal too much of his past. He told her only that he had served in the military and worked as a contractor overseas. He remained vague about the specifics of his missions and the scars that dotted his body. The offshore accounts he had accumulated during his contracting days? Laura would never know about them. John was cautious, but eventually he let his guard down enough to fall in love with Laura. They got married a year after they met, and for a while, it seemed like John had finally found peace. Laura, now 41 years old, was dedicated to her career, but she always made time for John. At first, their life together was perfect. They moved into a 2-story, 4-bedroom house in one of Denver's upscale neighborhoods. They were even talking about starting a family. For the first couple of years, things were great. John, now 45 years old, had found a comfortable rhythm in his new life as a security consultant. He spent most of his time at home, away from the chaos of his previous career. He and Laura enjoyed each other's company, and though they had their fair share of disagreements, like any couple, they worked through them. But over time, things started to change. Laura began spending more and more hours at the office, working late into the night on big cases and going out for drinks with colleagues after work. John didn't think much of it at first. He understood the demands of her profession. But soon, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It all came to a head at a summer party hosted by Laura's law firm. As always, John went with her to the event, but the moment they walked in, he had a sinking feeling in his gut. Laura introduced him to her coworkers, as she always did. But when she introduced him to the newest attorney at the firm, Ethan Brooks, John froze. Ethan was tall, well-built, with a chiseled face, and as soon as John laid eyes on him, he knew this man was trouble. For a moment, John thought maybe it was just paranoia, but when Ethan extended his hand and flashed a smug smile, it all came rushing back. This wasn't just some new colleague. This was the same man who had worked with him on a contract in Sierra Leone years ago. Back then, Ethan had betrayed John and the team by taking a bribe to switch sides in the middle of an operation. John had barely survived that mission, and he hadn't seen Ethan since. Now, standing face to face with the man who had once tried to kill him, John felt a storm brewing inside him. Ethan's smile told John everything he needed to know. He hadn't forgotten, and he certainly wasn't sorry. John didn't bother shaking Ethan's hand. He turned and walked away, leaving Laura confused and calling after him. "John, wait!" "What's wrong?" "I don't trust that guy," John said as Laura caught up to him. "Something about him is off." Laura frowned. "Ethan? He's one of the firm's rising stars. We're working on a couple of big projects together. You'll have to get used to him." John clenched his jaw. "You're working with him?" "Yes, John." "Why is that a problem?" she asked, her frustration starting to show. "Come on, we need to get back to the party." John followed her back to the table, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to go very wrong. As they sat down, Ethan gave John a knowing look, his eyes full of malice. Laura, oblivious to the tension between the two men, chatted away with her colleagues. Later in the evening, when Laura stepped away to talk to a coworker, Ethan leaned across the table toward John. "You know, what happened in Sierra Leone? That was just business. But now that I know Laura is your wife, things just got personal." John's blood boiled. "If you touch her, I'll kill you," he said quietly, his voice like ice. Ethan smirked. "You're always so dramatic, John. I've already been with her. And before this is over, I'll make sure you see it happen again, right in front of you." John's hands tightened into fists under the table, but he kept his composure. "If you ever come near her again, I'll put a bullet in your head." Ethan just laughed. "We'll see," he said, his voice full of menace. When Laura returned, she glanced between the two men, sensing that something was off. "Is everything okay?" she asked, trying to ease the tension. "Yeah," Ethan said with a grin. "John and I are getting to know each other." John didn't respond, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. As the night wore on, the tension between John and Ethan only grew. Laura could feel it, but she tried to ignore it, hoping things would smooth over. After the obligatory speeches and some dancing, Laura dragged John onto the dance floor. She leaned into him, But John's mind was elsewhere, his eyes scanning the room, always finding their way back to Ethan. "John, what's going on?" Laura asked softly. "You're so tense tonight." "How well do you know Ethan?" John asked, his voice low and controlled. "We've been working together for a few months now." "Why?" "You didn't answer my question," John pressed. "How well do you know him?" Laura pulled back slightly, frowning. "What do you mean?" "He's just a colleague, John. You're acting weird." "Have you slept with him?" John asked directly, his voice sharp as a knife. Laura's body stiffened, and she couldn't hide the slight flinch in her expression. That was all the confirmation John needed. He let out a slow breath, his heart hardening. "How long?" he asked coldly. "John, it doesn't mean anything," Laura whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "It means everything to me," John said. "You know what I've been through. You know how I feel about betrayal." Laura wiped at her eyes, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened. But it's over now." "Bullshit," John replied calmly, his tone cutting through her words. "You could have said no, but you didn't." "I love you, John. I really do. Please believe me," Laura pleaded. "Then you won't have any problem ending it, will you?" John said, his voice steady. "Tell him right now, in front of me." Laura's heart raced. "Right now?" "Right now," John repeated. Reluctantly, Laura nodded, and they made their way back to the table where Ethan was sitting. Ethan's smug smile only fueled John's anger. He watched as Laura, with a shaky voice, said the words John had demanded. "Mike, we can't see each other anymore. I'm married, and I want to stay that way," she said, her eyes avoiding John's. Ethan nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off John. "I see," he said. "Well, I guess the better man won. Again." He extended his hand toward John, but John only stared at it with disdain, before turning to walk away. Laura followed him, but the weight of what had just happened hung between them. They left the party early, the car ride home filled with an unbearable silence. John's mind was racing, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He didn't speak, and Laura didn't dare break the silence. When they got home, John didn't go to bed. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, his mind turning over the events of the night. Laura stood in the doorway, watching him. She wanted to say something, anything to fix what she had broken, but she was too afraid of what he might say in return. "Are we okay?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. John looked up at her, his face unreadable. "That's up to you," he said after a long pause. "As long as you stay away from him, maybe. But if I find out you're still seeing him, we're done. Understand?" Laura nodded quickly. "I understand. I'll end it. I'll find a way." "You'd better," John said, his tone cold and final. The next morning, after Laura left for work, John sat at the kitchen table, his mind still racing. He didn't trust her words, not completely. The betrayal cut too deep, and his instincts told him that he needed to verify things for himself. Without hesitation, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Bill Carter speaking," came the gruff voice on the other end. "Bill, it's John. I need a favor," John said, leaning back in his chair. "Anything for you, man. You saved my ass more times than I can count," Bill replied. "What do you need?" "I need surveillance on my wife and someone she's been seeing. I want everything. Audio, video, the works," John said, his voice calm but firm. Bill didn't hesitate. "Consider it done. How much you want to spend?" John shook his head, though Bill couldn't see him. "It's not about money, Bill. I need this done right." "You got it. I'll get my team on it. Give me a few days," Bill said. "And don't worry, this one's on the house. You've done more for me than I can ever repay." "Thanks, Bill. I owe you one," John replied. A week later, John received a large manila envelope at his doorstep. Inside were photos, recordings, and videos, evidence of everything he had feared. Laura was still seeing Ethan. Despite her promises, she hadn't ended it. That Friday, John sat at the kitchen table once more, the envelope in front of him, along with his .45 caliber pistol. His mind was made up. It was time to confront her. At around 6:30 p.m., Laura walked through the door, looking tired from work. She glanced into the kitchen and saw John sitting at the table with the envelope and the gun laid out in front of him. Her stomach dropped, and fear crept into her voice. "John, what's going on?" she asked hesitantly. "Sit down," John said in a neutral tone, not looking up at her. Laura remained standing, trembling slightly. "John." "I said sit down," John thundered, his voice sending a jolt through her. She quickly pulled out a chair and sat down, her hands shaking. "You've been caught," John began, his tone controlled and steady. "I've got it all, photos, video, everything." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes. "John, I'm so sorry. I made a mistake." John nodded slowly, opening the envelope and pulling out a few pictures, laying them in front of her. "Do I need to show you the rest? What about the video?" Her eyes widened, and she covered her mouth with her hand. "You have video?" she whispered, horrified. "In high definition," John replied. "But do you know what hurt more than seeing you with him? Hearing you two talk about me like I was nothing?" Laura's tears flowed freely now. "I never meant to hurt you, John. Please believe me." "Stop crying," John said coldly. "You made your choice. Now, you need to deal with the consequences." Laura looked up at him, her face pale, but there was a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "You think you're innocent? I know all about you, John. I know what you did as a contractor. You've killed people, haven't you? You think that won't come out if we get divorced?" John chuckled darkly. "Oh, you think you know everything? You don't know half of it. Yes, I've killed people, but I've never betrayed anyone I loved. That's the difference." Laura shook her head. "You're not as clean as you think you are, and if you push me, I'll make sure everyone knows what you are." John leaned forward, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You can try, but you won't like the outcome." Laura's face drained of color. "What are you going to do?" John stared at her for a long moment. "Are you still planning to meet Ethan this weekend? You told me you had a work trip out of town, but I know you're lying." Laura hesitated before answering. "How did you know?" John didn't respond to her question. "Call him, right now. Tell him it's over." Laura hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for her phone. "John, please." "Call him," John repeated, his voice icy and unwavering. "Right now. Put it on speaker." She dialed Ethan's number, her heart pounding. After a few rings, Ethan answered with his usual smug tone. "Hey, baby, you ready for me to pick you up?" Laura's voice shook as she spoke, her eyes darting nervously toward John. "No, Ethan. I'll come to your place, and we can go from there." Ethan sounded confused. "What? I thought we had this all planned out?" John leaned in closer, his patience thin. "Tell him the truth." Laura swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't see you anymore, Ethan. It's over." There was a long pause on the other end. "What the hell is this about?" Ethan demanded. John spoke before Laura could answer. "She's done with you, Ethan, and if you ever come near her again, I'll make sure you regret it." Ethan's voice turned cold. "John, I should have known you'd be in the middle of this. You can't control everything, you know. Stay away from her, or I'll put a bullet in your head." "This is your last warning," John growled. There was silence for a moment, then Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "You're such a tough guy, John. But you're not scaring me. You're just digging yourself a deeper hole." John hung up the phone without another word, tossing it back toward Laura. "It's over." Laura sat frozen in her seat, her body trembling. "John, please." "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I still love you. I don't want to lose you." John stood up, his face hardened with resolve. "You already lost me the moment you betrayed me." She looked up at him, her eyes red and filled with tears. "What are you going to do?" "You're going to leave, tonight. Pack your things and get out. John said, his voice cold and final. Laura's breath caught in her throat. John, no. We can fix this. Please don't do this. John shook his head. I can't trust you anymore, Laura. And without trust, we've got nothing. Laura wiped her tears, standing up from the table. She turned toward the bedroom to start packing, her shoulders slumped in defeat. John watched her leave, his heart heavy. He had loved her, but the betrayal was too deep, too final. There was no coming back from it. An hour later, Laura stood at the door with her suitcase in hand. I'm sorry, John, she said, her voice weak. John nodded but didn't say a word as she walked out the door. As the door clicked shut, the house fell into a heavy silence. The silence that filled the house after Laura left was deafening, but John welcomed it. For the first time in a long while, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. As the night went on, John stayed up, unable to sleep. He replayed everything in his mind, from the moment he first met Laura to the last words they exchanged at the door. The memories felt distant now, like echoes from another life. The following day, John contacted Bill again. I need you to keep an eye on Ethan for me, John said over the phone. You got it, Bill replied without hesitation. I'll let you know if anything comes up. Days passed, and John tried to move forward. He went about his business as usual, focusing on his security consulting work. But despite his efforts to push the past behind him, something gnawed at him. It wasn't over. Not yet. Then, one evening, Bill called with an urgent update. John, we've got a problem. Ethan's planning something. John's pulse quickened. What do you mean? I've been keeping tabs on him, like you asked. Overheard a conversation he had with some pretty shady guys. He's planning to take Laura with him on some island trip in the Bahamas. But it's not what you think. He's not just taking her for a vacation. He's selling her, John, to some really dangerous people. John's jaw clenched, his mind racing. Selling her? Yeah, Bill confirmed. He's handing her over to some scum in exchange for money. They'll make her disappear. Probably use her in some trafficking ring. We've got less than 24 hours before they make the deal. I'm sending you the details now. You'll need to act fast. John's heart pounded in his chest. Despite everything Laura had done, despite the betrayal, he couldn't let her fall into the hands of people like that. He owed it to her, and to himself, not to let that happen. Get me transportation to the Bahamas. I'm on my way, John said. You got it, boss, Bill replied. Details will be in your inbox in a few minutes. John ended the call and immediately started preparing. He retrieved his Thompson submachine gun from the locked chest in the attic, making sure it was fully loaded. His old instincts kicked in as he dressed in tactical gear, readying himself for a mission he thought he had left behind long ago. An hour later, John was at a private airstrip, boarding a small jet that Bill had arranged. The flight was quick, but to John, it felt like an eternity. His mind was focused on one thing, saving Laura and putting an end to Ethan once and for all. When the plane touched down on a dirt airstrip in the Bahamas, the pilot gave John a nod. I'll be waiting for your signal. John nodded back. Thanks. As John stepped off the plane, Bill was waiting for him with a grim look on his face. They're not far from here. Van Owen's got a fire going. Should be easy to spot from a distance. Lead the way, John said. Bill led John through the dense vegetation until they reached the edge of the camp. From their vantage point, John could see Laura tied to a stake, her hands bound, as Ethan and 3 armed men stood nearby. Laura was crying, begging Ethan to let her go. You're gonna fetch me a nice price, Ethan sneered, lighting a cigarette. And there's nothing that dumb husband of yours can do about it. John's blood boiled, but he kept his cool. He turned to Bill. I'll handle this. Cover me from here. Bill nodded, taking position with his pistol. John moved silently toward the camp, his Thompson at the ready. He flipped the safety off and positioned himself for a clean shot. In a swift motion, he unleashed a burst of gunfire, taking down 2 of the guards before they could even react. The third one raised his weapon, but John was faster. Another short burst sent him sprawling to the ground. Ethan turned, his face a mask of shock and fear. "John, wait!" John didn't wait. He fired a 3-round burst, hitting Ethan square in the chest. Ethan crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath, his hand reaching out for Laura. But he wouldn't make it. As Ethan lay dying, John walked toward him, his expression cold and unflinching. Ethan struggled to speak, gasping for air, but John wasn't interested in hearing anything he had to say. He looked down at the man who had once tried to destroy his life, and gave a final dismissive glance before turning his back on him. John moved swiftly to Laura, cutting her restraints with a knife. She was shaking, her face pale and tear-streaked, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. "John," Laura whispered, her voice trembling. "Get up. We need to get out of here," John said, his voice firm but not unkind. He pulled her to her feet, his eyes scanning the area for any further threats. Laura, still in shock, stumbled as John helped her. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." John didn't respond. He led her away from the camp, back toward the plane that was waiting for them at the airstrip. As they moved through the dense jungle, the only sound that filled the air was the rustling of leaves and Laura's quiet sobs. John's mind was already focused on the next steps, making sure they got out of there safely. By the time they reached the plane, the sun had started to rise, casting a faint glow over the island. Bill was already there, keeping watch. "You good?" he asked as John and Laura approached. "Yeah, it's done," John replied. He looked over at Laura, who was too shaken to speak, her eyes red from crying. "Get her on the plane. We're leaving." Bill helped Laura onto the jet while John gave one last look at the jungle behind them. He felt no satisfaction in what he had done, only the grim realization that, once again, his life had come full circle. Once they were airborne, the silence in the cabin was palpable. Laura sat across from John, her hands trembling in her lap. She looked at him, searching for something, understanding, forgiveness, anything. But John's eyes were distant, cold. "John, I'm so sorry," Laura said, her voice barely audible. John didn't respond. He couldn't find the words. Everything that had happened between them was too fresh, too raw. He had saved her, but the damage was already done. There was no going back to the way things were. When they landed back in the U.S., John walked Laura to a waiting car. She turned to him one last time. "What now?" she asked, her voice full of uncertainty. John stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "You go your way. I go mine." Tears filled Laura's eyes again, but she didn't argue. She knew she had lost him, perhaps long before Ethan ever entered the picture. Without another word, she got into the car and drove away, leaving John standing on the tarmac, watching as she disappeared from his life for good. A few weeks passed, and John did his best to settle back into his routine. He filed for divorce on the grounds of abandonment, and within a few months, it was finalized. He told himself that this time, he was done with relationships. He wouldn't let himself be vulnerable again. But the world had a way of reminding him that his past was never far behind. One afternoon, as John sat in his living room, there was a knock at the door. He looked through the peephole and saw 2 men in dark suits, feds. John opened the door cautiously. "John Taylor?" one of the men asked, flashing a badge. "Special Agent Harris, FBI, this is Agent Wright. Can we come in?" John nodded and let them in, his expression unreadable. "What's this about?" he asked as they stepped inside. "We're just following up on a case involving Michael Brooks. We have reason to believe you were involved in some recent events in the Bahamas," Agent Harris said, taking a seat. John's face remained impassive. "I haven't been to the Bahamas in years. What's this about?" He's a former soldier with a dark past, and his wife's affair just turned deadly. Will John Taylor save her in time, or let her face the ultimate punishment? Watch now to see how this story ends. Michael Brooks was involved in human trafficking. We have evidence that he had plans to sell your ex-wife, Laura. We also found several bodies at a camp on the island, Agent Wright explained, all shot with a .45. John raised an eyebrow. A .45's a common round. Agent Harris smiled slightly. We know about your background, Mr. Taylor. You're something of a legend in certain circles, especially with that Thompson of yours. John leaned back in his chair. I don't know what you're talking about. Harris nodded slowly. Maybe not. We're not here to arrest you. We're just tying up loose ends. Michael Brooks was a dangerous man, and frankly, the world's a better place without him. But you understand. If we find out you had anything to do with this, we'll have to come back. Understood, John said, his voice calm. The agent stood up, preparing to leave. Merry Christmas, Mr. Taylor, Harris said with a faint smile as they headed for the door. John watched them leave, the weight of their words lingering in the air. He wasn't worried. He had covered his tracks well, but as he closed the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that the past, no matter how far behind, always had a way of catching up.